Dear friends, chers amis, as you understood, I'm not a customs specialist at all, and won't be able, to match, the presentation that has been done by Clive, this morning. But I think it's important also to remind everybody something. We are linked, and we've been working, with the Port of Dover, the FTA, and lots of other, organizations for now a few years, because before Brexit, we had also to deal with the migrant crisis in Calais. And so it goes back now a long time. And because of the migrant crisis, it helped us to understand that it was really easy suddenly to have huge traffic jams on both sides of the channel. And I think it's important to say it again. And we need always to be working together. And that's what we are trying to do. That's why we open an office here. That's why we try always to engage with ministries on this side of the channel, with the administration, and also to try to convince in France, our administrations and governments, that the reality on the ground is very different from the big picture and the big negotiation in Brussels. Obviously, we are not trying to interfere in the negotiation, but we've got a port in Calais where we are currently making an investment of more than 800 million. And the idea was actually to be able to trade more, to have something that was even more frictionless. And now we've got to try to keep it going, and we've got to try to decide what is going to happen on the port, how the lanes are going to be organized, where the customs are going to be. Because those plans have been drawn a couple of years ago now, and obviously we'll have to reorganize it. Unfortunately, as most of us here, we don't know exactly what to do. So we keep talking and endlessly saying we need help. Just don't think too big, go more on the ground, and let's try to engage. So the big problem we are facing at the moment is that we cannot put everybody around the table. So we do understand that obviously David Davis and Michel Barnier are in charge of the Brexit negotiation. But we have asked, and our President Xavier Bertrand has mentioned it recently again in Brussels, at the European Parliament, we need the people who are really in charge of logistics in ports, the hauliers, but also the customs, everybody to be able to talk without interfering in order to be able to start plans. Because obviously, everything is about time. Fluidity is all about time, but the negotiation and what's going to happen afterwards is also just about how long is that going to last? Are we going to have a transition period? How long is that transition period going to be? And obviously, I think everybody agrees that 2 years is too short. You can say it. So it's not a government secret. It will take maybe 4, maybe 6. We don't know exactly how many years to be able to find a system that works for both sides. And I can only share what Christian said this morning from the Port of Dover. That solution has got to be a French and British solution. If suddenly we have a system on one side and we don't have the same system on the other side, I mean, the idea that we are going to have 100% fluidity is not going to happen. It will be even more complex. We sit already at the port with some other type of controls. And we need the system to work for both Eurotunnel, for the Port of Calais, for the Port of Dunkirk on our French side, and all the other ports, are trading with these places, on the other side of the channel. So recently we've been, addressing, various, politicians in France, and very recently we had the president of the French Parliament in Calais, with his Brexit Commission. And very interestingly, and I think that's something we should push, a very senior MP was a former European minister under Macron government, Marielle de Sarnez, who's really a Europeanist. So you cannot say that she's someone who is not supporting the EU, said, I really believe, and I said it to Michel Barnier, that the French administration should be allowed actually to start talking technically, not politically, but technically, with the counterparts with HMRC and customs, in the UK. And that's definitely something we've got to try to make happen, because it is vital. If you don't do that, we can talk and talk, write lots of papers, but in the end, I'm not sure that we are going to come along with a suitable solution, and definitely not something that will improve, fluidity. So I know that in a certain way it can seem like interfering. It is not. It's just being pragmatic and to be able to, that every body structure that has done research, who has studied it, can exchange. So, and I'm very, very surprised that there are so many evidence around Brexit, but that there are so few evidence where all the people we need around the table are, for various reasons. And that's really what we need to try to get before the end of 2018, before we get there. What we are trying to do on top, we are testing one potential, not solution, but something that could ease the pain. It's something called FastPass, and that has been tested at the airport of Vienna, at the Romanian border, and at the Piraeus port in Greece. It's technology. So again, I'm not a specialist. I cannot tell you, this is the solution. I know that there are lots of different options, lots of different technologies that could be used. But the President of the Hauts-de France, Xavier Bertrand, has written to Pierre Moscovici asking for this FastPass tech solution to be implemented in Calais, Dunkirk, and its tunnel as a test as soon as possible, in order to see if that's the right one first, if it works on a larger scale for a big, trade zone like ours. So that's one point. And then our second main concern, I know that, and I've seen the poll that you've done, and that lots of you are really concerned about the custom, part. We are very concerned about one other piece, which are the sanitary controls, because that's really complex in terms of infrastructure to implement, and people and everything. And I think that, for example, the French douane have done a great work over the last 3 years to ease the paperwork, and I know that lots of other bodies in Europe have done as well. But sanitary controls is something else. And that's definitely a very real focus for us. And then another one, as we see lots of trade going through the ports and the tunnel, is the rules of origin. So yes, obviously customs are an issue, and a cost. And the third one, and that's where also we are trying to put an effort, is, and that's been mentioned this morning, are the small and mid-sized companies. And we see it in the region, but not only. So sanitary, rules of origin, and small and mid-sized companies are really a big concern for us. And that's what really we're trying to work on. And we believe that for that reason, to have a forum where European bodies, customs specialists, could really exchange. I mean, it's not interfering with the negotiation. It's trying to bring, good and common sense. So that's what we are trying to do. I would like, to be able to be more positive. I'm not negative. I know that in the end, probably in 10 years, things will get better. But we have to go through a very difficult path. Thank you very much.
I would like to call to the stage Tony Buckley, formerly from Irish Customs and Revenue, who until only a few weeks ago, I think, was technically the Brexit lead at Irish Customs, and therefore involved in a lot of the discussions that have been taking place both in Dublin as well as in Brussels, and obviously very knowledgeable about both customs and the process of Brexit itself. So Tony, over to you.
Thank you, Pauline. Yes, I retired as head of customs in May of this year, which is why it's possible for me to be here, because as a serving civil servant, it simply isn't possible to attend UK conferences in case it might be perceived as interfering. As Jean-Paul mentioned, the Task Force 50 team are very sensitive about any interference with the negotiations. The drawback, of course, is that I am now retired, which means that my views are all my own. I'm no longer speaking on behalf of any part of the Irish government. Whether that's a drawback, time will tell. Okay, we started looking at Brexit in 2015 because of the importance of it to Ireland. We started contingency planning and looking at what the impacts might be. And the first few slides I have here are really the fruits of research and the fruits of thinking, and I'm presenting them to give you a context, if you like, to help you to understand where the Irish perspective is coming from. First of all, from a customs point of view, Brexit is unprecedented. The customs union is 50 years old this year. Britain's been part of it from the outset. So we've had 50 years of increasing liberalisation of trade, and Brexit is going backwards on that. So obviously it means undoing or unpicking a system which I would say most of the people in the room here is the only system, pardon me, is the only system you've ever seen. So it's quite unusual in that way. Also worldwide, I mean, the World Customs Organization has more or less standardized customs around the world at this point. And many countries we've seen over the last 50 years how customs and trade develop hand in hand. Border control usually comes first, and then trade develops in the knowledge and the acceptance of how customs works and what the different controls are. And so trade grows and business structures develop around the regulatory framework. And the effect of that has been, as we demolish the regulations, as we make them simpler and so on, trade has increased worldwide. You're now looking at a situation where the world's freest trade area, and the EU is quite unique, the single market is quite unique in the world, in having no border controls at all. And that has led to not just free trade, but to an interweaving of supply chains across the borders in Europe, with just-in-time supplies, with the manufacture and production and distribution of goods taking place in several countries across Europe as a matter of routine. Brexit is now saying, no, we're dropping a border in the middle of that. The impact, particularly for Ireland, I have compared it to separating Siamese twins. The effects of that operation, as you know, are always painful and sometimes catastrophic. So there's no precedent, we don't know. And the number of variables involved is so many, and they will all change, that any of the modelling that we've seen, any of the economic predictions and so on, have only one thing in common: they're all wrong. I don't know whether they're over-optimistic or under-optimistic, but they're definitely wrong, because there is no model that can model the huge variety and range of variables that Brexit involves. So I'm tempted to paraphrase Alan Greenspan in his famous quote, if Brexit appears to be particularly clear, you probably misunderstood. This is just to give you some context in terms of Ireland-UK, the importance of the countries to each other. And it shows the ranking of Ireland in UK imports-exports for various categories of product, and the ranking of the UK in Irish imports-exports, again for varieties of products. Overall, Ireland is the 9th most important country for UK imports and the 7th most important for exports. And for Ireland, the UK is the most important country for our imports and the 2nd most important for our exports. This is all merchandise trade. It doesn't take account of services, which of course are very significant also. So it's important to us. Now and please bear with me here, this is the technical expertise that Jean-Paul referred to leaking out a little bit. I just want to quickly recap the basis, if you like, of customs and borders. So the customs union simply deals with customs duties. The single market is the really important innovation in Europe. And the single market, its existence is based on the application of a huge number of EU regulations which are agreed between the member states and which are policed very thoroughly across Europe by EU Commission and various regulatory bodies operating under the treaties. So essentially, if you pull out of the single market, if you leave the EU, if you're not an EU member, then the only precedent there is that there must be border controls because the regulations will apply, and if you want freedom to deviate from the regulatory regime, then your compliance will be checked at the border. That's the way it's done, and that means you will have border controls. The reason I'm saying this is not to try to convince you, but to explain Irish thinking, okay? The role of customs then is we're essentially the gatekeepers. Customs duties can be built into a business model unless they're extremely punitive, which they are in terms of some food products and so on. But generally speaking, world trade has operated very nicely, thanks very much, with customs duties. What's more difficult is, again, as Jean-Paul adverted to, the regulatory regime. Sanitary and phytosanitary products, which is agri-food, basically, to you and me. They need to be controlled. There are very strict controls there. They're checked at the border. The quality of goods placed on the market, the keeping of standards, all of those things. That's a particular problem for Ireland because many of the goods on the Irish market are in fact certified and authorised by standards authorities based in the UK. So that's something we have to do, is to authorise standards authorities ourselves. It's a pretty quick process. We simply conduct the legal procedures to carry out the authorizations, but it's something that needs to be done. Many of the goods, for example, during the transition period, the UK will no longer be able to be the lead authorising authority for any standards. That's from March next year. That means that certain goods may not have the appropriate authorizations to be placed on the European market, regardless of the border. Again, that checking will be carried out at the border as part of what is referred to as customs checking, but it's not customs law. It's different sets of regulations. So customs is essentially the gatekeeper, if you like, for the single market. I stole this slide actually from a Taxud presentation in Brussels because it summarizes the position quite neatly. And if you look through it, and I'm not asking you to read it now, I'm sure you'll get copies of the slides afterwards. The green boxes, which are the ones associated with EU membership, are the only ones where you don't have border controls. All the other options, you've got some class of border control. Again, not saying that to upset you, just to explain that from the Irish perspective, what we're planning for is some form of border control. So what do we prepare for? In general terms, vulnerability of cross-border supply chains, of course. The feedback that we've got, and we've carried out a lot of consultation with industry and business, they're not so much concerned about having to meet new regulations or having to, produce new pieces of paper after Brexit. What they're concerned about is uncertainty. How do we know that we can deliver? How do we know that we can get goods imported in 2 days or 3 days? How can we make a contract saying we will deliver in such and such a time if there is uncertainty? And from an Irish perspective, that uncertainty is magnified because so many of our goods travel by roll-on, roll-off across the UK. So you're now going out of the EU to come back into the EU. Can you still assure your customers that you can deliver on time? And that's where your supply chain becomes vulnerable, because a failure to deliver on a crucial shipment can wreck a relationship, as you know. Additional and changed regulatory requirements, that's a matter of housekeeping, of structuring your business, of making sure that you can stand up to any scrutiny that may come on you. Possible ongoing cost increases. In Ireland, a standard quotation for one shipment through customs to a third country is about 50 euros. Don't know what it is here. Obviously, if you're going to continue shipping, for example, on a just-in-time basis, where it's one item per shipment, then you're talking about sending a machine part worth 10 euros and paying 50 euros for customs. Thanks, that's going to work really well. So, it means you've got to change that. The complication of logistics and transport rules, I know others have spoken and will be speaking again about permits, the ability, how many trucks can a country have in another country, what are the operations, what's the cabotage, all of that. That's not my own area of expertise, I'm happy to say. It doesn't sound like one I'd readily take to, but it's one that I know is of great interest to you and is being dealt with today. And then the transitional disruption. If you were to take a crystal ball and say in 5 years' time, what will things be like? Well, in 5 years' time, there will have been a solution. It's how we get from here to there. That's the issue, really. For Ireland, we have major sectoral risks, particularly our beef and dairy sectors, the food sectors generally. The UK is a hugely important market, and we're very concerned about, again, as is France, I know, the agricultural produce and food, how that's going to work. It is technically possible to come up with a solution. It certainly is legally possible to come up with a solution. Unfortunately, because of the political situation, we're not in a position to start talking about technical solutions as yet. We have a very vulnerable route to market across the UK. And in anticipation of that, Irish ferry companies have just, by September, we will have the 3 largest roll-on, roll-off ferries in the world operating between Ireland and France. Well, sorry, 2 to France, 1 to Spain. It's a start, and it's an indication of how serious the Irish transport industry takes this problem, that as a fallback, direct access to the continent is seen as essential, just in case. Port congestion, I know that the Port of Dover, from the blurb here, handles 2.5 million units of freight a year. Dublin Port handles 1 million containers a year, and approximately, we think, about 0.6 million small commercials, vans and such like. It's simply not possible to process that volume through customs in the traditional sense. So we need new solutions. And again, as I know because I've spoken to our French colleagues, we are considering solutions. And again, it is possible to say that there are technical solutions. And once again, we haven't been able to discuss them with the UK. So it's an issue. I'll come back to that port idea again. Online purchases are huge. Britain is a huge hub for online purchase handling. All of the express carriers operate through air hubs, in particular in the UK. We would be looking at an additional, currently in Ireland, our third country imports amount to about 1.3 million items, 1.3 million customs declarations, a year. Many more items than that. And we're looking at something of the order of 20 to 30 million additional items just from online purchases a year. So we're looking at multiplying our customs system by a factor of 10 to 20. It's huge, and the biggest part of that, as I say, is small items, online purchases. We have a new third country on our border, and that means we have to be looking at helicopter trips, boat trips, people just wandering across the border, things like that, from a customs perspective, things which never concerned us before. So that's a whole new perspective for us. We need to protect Irish origin. Made in Ireland is a brand we're particularly proud of. We've worked on it very hard, invested a lot in it. If we had, for example, the brass plating of British companies coming to Ireland to have a place within the EU and simply bringing in goods and then selling them on, having changed the label from made in the UK to made in Ireland, that wouldn't be good for us. So that's an issue going forward. Not that we would be, of course, proud to rebadge any UK product, but the French might have a different view to that practice. Market authorization and supply procedures, I've already mentioned that we need to revise how goods on the Irish market are certified. You see, as you'll all be aware, it's more or less standard for international brands now. Even Lavazza coffee I found, which is my favourite coffee, the price in Ireland went up. And I asked the salesman, what's going on? He says, Brexit. I said, hold on. Lavazza is Italian. That's a Euro country. We're a Euro country. Ah, yes, but it comes through England, right? Which it does. Even Lidl and Aldi, the German retailers, the operation in Ireland is a subsidiary of that in the UK. It's standard and has been standard since approximately the time of Henry VIII, that the UK and Ireland is almost a hyphenated world in retail and distribution, that the franchise is just UK and Ireland. That won't operate anymore. How that's going to change exactly, I don't know. There are a number of options, a number of ways it could change, but it'll bring about a big change in commercial practice. And the implications of that, as I say, are complex and interesting. So when do we prepare? Well, January 2021, assuming the transition period happens, which is not assured by any means. Assuming it happens, we're looking at January 2021 with some changes, as I say, notably the market authorization and so on, happening from March 2019. So you have 2 years at most. The transition really is for business, which is a message that maybe isn't always clear. You can change the law overnight if you really need to. So legal provisions, new regulations and so on, you can just do them. Business can't change that quickly. And the 2-year transition period is really to allow business to change. And I know that in Ireland and here, there's still a reluctance by some business people, for very good reasons, because it costs money and it takes time, to begin the process of change. But really, you do need to start. The structural stuff, examining your supply chain, identifying vulnerabilities, trying out different business models, talking to experts. The customs and regulatory options are there. As I say, Brexit's unprecedented in very many ways, not least its size and its complexity. And certainly in Ireland, we're taking the view, my ex-colleagues in customs are taking the view that they want to engage with business, that if business sees a problem, they should ask, come and talk to us. Because in the Union Customs Code, there are a lot of opportunities for specific, business-specific arrangements. And essentially, to get through the ports and to get through the airports, to get through the whole regulatory thing, advance notice, advance information, advance agreement on systems and advance certification makes it all very, very straightforward. Later on, as I said, the governments will need to register and authorize traders, do public information, and make the legal changes. How do you prepare? The biggest thing for the official side or the government side everywhere is to optimize administrative flexibility. The way that you would like to see it is that the regulatory requirements shouldn't of themselves cause problems at the ports and airports. In other words, there should be an option, if businesses choose to use the options, that will get you straight through a port post-Brexit in the same way as you get through now. It means you will have to prepare. There'll be a lot more documentation and different kinds of documentation. You'll need to have that lodged in advance. It's so much simpler if you have AEO status, right? And you can get agreement beforehand that every week I'm going to send, or every day I'm going to send 1 container, 5 containers containing this and this and this, and it'll go through. And then the customs authorities can check the paperwork and remove those shipments from their risk rating systems so that they will not trigger for a check or a search, and they just go straight through. That's quite doable, but it takes work and it takes preparation. So you need to get advice and do the research yourselves as well. Most of what you need to know is online, available. Well worth your while to at least know what the system is, even if you then decide to go and hire a customs agent, or if you're particularly wealthy, one of the big 5 accountancy firms to tell you what to do, that's fine. But you should know yourself, because this is intrinsic to your business. Restructure to minimize exposure. That may not be anything dramatic. It may simply be just making different arrangements. Perhaps rent a warehouse somewhere closer to your point of delivery for contingency in case your just-in-time delivery breaks down at one point. At least have some reserve there to cover you. It might be as simple as that. Could be more complex for larger operations. Liaise with authorities. As I say, talk to the authorities, particularly customs. They will talk to you. Well, I can't speak for the UK, of course. Sorry. And the Irish customs will only talk to Irish business, so yeah, sorry about that. Anyway, transport. Yeah, the ports and airports, I covered most of this already. Really, the objective is to avoid, so far as possible, the need for huge car parks and new infrastructure. What that means is that the goods arriving at the point of customs clearance are already cleared. In other words, that they're expected, that all the documentation is in, and that they simply go through. Whether by number plate recognition or container number recognition or by barcode or by whatever, that they simply drive through, that it's all done in the background. That doesn't work anywhere right now. Okay, the fast pass that Jean-Paul mentioned is a step in that direction, but it doesn't actually operate anywhere right now. I mean, at the eastern borders of the EU, a 3-hour wait is regarded as pretty good for a truck. You try that at Dover or at Holyhead or at Dublin, and you've got chaos. You just trade stops. Simple as that. We've been modeling on the basis that even what happens on the Norway-Sweden border, which is held up as one of the best, there you're talking about a truck taking 15 minutes to get through. That's about 14 minutes more than we can afford to allow them. So we need something really special. And it's doable. What it means, it takes cooperation from the transport operators and the ports and the producers. Because at the moment, I don't know if you're familiar, you probably are, some of you anyway, when a truck arrives or a container arrives in a port, at that point the customs agent lodges the customs declaration. So the idea of going into a storage for third country goods is taken as standard. We've got to get rid of that idea. So you need your customs declaration in advance. That would help to reduce, because you possibly will have to make a security declaration anyway. If you make a full customs declaration, it can double up as a security declaration. You'd also need then to give some information on the mode of transport. And ideally, I suppose using shorthand, what we'd like to see is something like the Ryanair approach. If you're flying Ryanair, you have to give them your passport details. Now, of course, there's no legal requirement to give them your passport details. It's just if you don't, you're not flying Ryanair. We'd like that arrangement, which we kind of politely call voluntary, to operate on the ferries, right? In other words, nobody gets on the ferry unless you've got some kind of receipt on your phone or something showing that your paperwork has been lodged. Because otherwise the ferry may very well be bringing you back again. And that's the reason Ryanair is doing it. Operating something like that, we've seen it work, as I say, with Ryanair. If it could be accepted, then it could operate on the ferries. But it will take a lot of cooperation between a lot of different players. Coming to that again, one of the issues for the last bullet point there, transport operators need to think about just what's your role in the system, in the whole system. It works best, most reliably and most smoothly if one of the players in the supply chain takes responsibility for all of the information. That can be a customs agent, it can be the consignor, can be the consignee, can be anybody in the chain. But the one that's really at the coalface and is dealing with the practicality of ports and regulations and checks and what have you is the transport operator. And there is a question there, certainly for larger transport operators. I think there's an opportunity to actually offer a service of completing, as it were, the supply chain. Finally, what's likely to happen? Continued political uncertainty with a last-minute resolution. That's not going to surprise anybody. Some additional controls on transport and trade. Now, what they're called doesn't matter. It can be new customs forms, it can be regulatory forms, it can be the sanitary controls, whatever, but there will be some additional controls. There will be a very painful adjustment period, especially for SMEs. The idea of a white van picking up 100 parcels and driving across the border is just not going to be practical. Because in any shipment of 100 individual parcels, at least one is going to trigger for a customs check. So that van's going to be pulled every time and searched every time, and all 100 parcels will be delayed while we examine the one that triggered. So that model is essentially going to be dead. So SMEs are going to suffer. Some disruption around the final Brexit day, whenever that happens. Because on one day you'll have no regulations and free trade, and on the following day you'll have full regulations and not free trade. And it doesn't matter how you stack that up and how you prepare for it, there's going to be some disruption around that day. There's no question about it. And business needs to anticipate that and prepare for it. Long-term reduction in volume is likely to be greater than value reduction. The volume of trade between the EU and Russia, the volume of road traffic, is just about 1 million commercial vehicles a year. That's in both directions. So 500,000 in, 500,000 out. That's how many days between Dover and France? I said earlier, we don't know what the effects of Brexit will be. But when you look around the world and you look at friendly borders, really friendly borders, Norway, Sweden is about 0.8 of a million in terms of trucks. Between Northern Ireland and Ireland, there is 4.6 million border crossings, commercial border crossings in a year. So what's likely to happen is that because there will be procedures to go through, so you'll have fewer crossings, fewer shipments, but of a much higher individual value. So people will consolidate, supply chains will change, because it simply won't be as cheap to cross the border anymore or as simple. So the volumes are likely to fall quite dramatically over time. And the volume of personal traffic may or may not fall. That's, tourist traffic and such. You'd expect, it won't be all that viable to drive over to France to get the wine for your son's wedding anymore. So that kind of traffic we would expect to fall off. But apart from that, it's very hard to say. And overall, I must say, just like Jean-Paul, I'd like to finish and say I'm quite optimistic. I think trade will continue. There's no question about that. We managed to do business with Russia and with China and Afghanistan and God knows who else. So we certainly will continue to do business with Britain. But getting from here to the other side of the Brexit transition, that is the real problem. Thank you very much for your attention.